Hi everyone, welcome to another lecture. Last time we did we continued talking about the transatlantic slave trade, um, sort of um, getting more into detail about the journey and how horrific it was. We also talked about Aluda Equiano, which was one of the first-hand accounts that we had of the transatlantic slave trade, right? Although Equiano would later oversee slaves himself and mostly worked on ships, so it wasn't the plantation story that we're familiar with. Um, it was an interesting count indeed, right? Because it sort of changed people's minds about slavery because they never knew what the slaves actually felt. We also talked about the Zong massacre, which Aluda Equiano attempted to bring attention to, and how those slaves were thrown overboard because the crew mistakenly, did not land on Jamaica, and thus they threw the slaves overboard in order to collect insurance money. Fortunately, they didn't collect that money. The court said that they could not because they lied, but that just shows you that that was something that did happen. If they got the idea, others implemented it. And then finally, we talked about the La Amistad, right? Um, and how that was the rare slave rebellion that actually worked, right? They overthrew the slave ship owners and sailors, killed them all, made it to America, even though they wanted to go back to Africa, and won their freedom through the courts. Although, again, that story is not, it's not normal, right? We'll talk about couple more slave rebellions in this class, and those certainly did not end up being successful. So today we're going to finish the second PowerPoint by talking about what happened to the slaves when they got to the Americas and how they were taught how to become slaves, right? Because you don't just show up to the plantation and know what to do, right? There's some form of forceful training. And then we'll begin the third PowerPoint by talking about a couple different states and how they dealt with slavery, and we'll continue along the same lines next time. Okay, I hope you guys are enjoying the class so far. I hope you guys are learning a lot, and feel free to ask me any questions if you're interested in the material, and I'll be happy to help. So last time I forgot to show you, this was actually a news article about La Amistad and showing a depiction of the slaves rising up and killing Captain Farrer, right? This circulated quite widely, and it really freaked out people, as I mentioned last time, right? They were much more cautious when conducting the slave trade, and even the masters at home were very paranoid about their slaves rising up. So the process that went into training slaves on how to become slaves, or reconditioning them is what we could also call it, was called seasoning. Okay, and here you can see a master, or actually most of the time the overseers would do this. So you see he's whipping a slave, right, as part of either punishment or training. So often the masters would have their overseers, which were basically managers who would go around and make sure that the slaves were behaving and that they were working as they were supposed to. Okay, those are the oftentimes men who would inflict the punishment, right? The master, depending on how many overseers he had, didn't get his hands quite dirty. Okay, so you're on this dingy ship, right, packed to the brim with people. You can't move most of the time. You have horrible food, aka you're malnourished, you're dehydrated because you don't have a lot of water. So you arrive in the Americas, right? When you first arrive, you were first washed, shaved, and scrubbed with palm oil so that your sellers could hide the sores and wounds that you suffered from the journey. Okay, so making sure that you look sellable. The men who showed up to buy them were usually either the plantation owners themselves or wholesalers who would resell them to their customers. So some men would buy slaves in batches and bring them to the plantation so the master didn't have to go into town. At this point, any families that were captured and transported together were usually split up, as well as any friendships that were made during the journey. Typically, a slave men and women were valued for different reasons, and we'll go into that a little bit too. And children were a little bit less valuable because they couldn't work immediately. Like, you still had to feed them, but they couldn't work, and you had to train them. So each family member has different value. Of course, old people had no value, but typically they weren't captured because they knew like an old person wouldn't be able to work. So the first video I have for you today is video A, and this is a clip from a show called Outlander. Now, you guys are in high school, so maybe you haven't seen this. It's sort of more adult. But Outlander is a show about a woman who, in the 1940s, she goes to Scotland with her husband. She touches these stones in Scotland, and she's transported back to the 1700s. Okay, and in the fourth season, is it? No, I think it's. Yeah, I think it's the third or fourth season. Her and her husband end up in Jamaica. So you'll see in video A a clip of her sort of freaking out because she's transported into this slave market, right? She's by her time, there is still racial segregation, but there aren't people in cages, right? So you can see sort of maybe a reaction we would all have if we were stuck in the past and we had to encounter this. Okay, so a very interesting show, although again, it has some adult themes, So Creole slaves, I mentioned the Creoles before, right? Because on the Amistad they saved a Creole man. So Creoles, we'll get into a little bit more as well, were the most valuable because they were mixed race. So they were typically French American. They were maybe mixed with Spanish, maybe too, Native American and Black. Okay, and they were the most valuable because they typically were already in America. Okay, so you didn't have to pay extra because of their journey. African slaves, in contrast, were the least valuable, being from opposite conditions and undergoing such a taxing journey, right? They were pretty banged up after this journey, which everybody would be. Some slavers attempted to pass off their African slaves as Creole in order to make a bigger profit. For those who were sold in the South American and Caribbean colonies, they would be put through special seasoning camps where they were broken down through torture so they could be conditioned for their new lives. Okay, so basically they try to break your spirit, right? They try to make sure that you have no fight in you and you'll do your work. One of the main things that were conditioned out of slaves were their names. Because they were difficult to pronounce, so often they would be forced to adopt Christian names. And they were also branded sometimes by their slavers and other times by their masters. So if they ran away, you'd be able to tell where they belonged. This is what we do to horses and cattle and stuff. It's very inhumane. So the second video, video B, is of the series Roots, which I think I've mentioned before, right? It was a series in the 70s based on a book, I think by Alex Huxley, about a slave named Kuta Kente. In this scene, Kuta Kente is being whipped because he refuses to give up his name. Okay, so that's sort of what usually happened, right? Breaking the spirit. Oftentimes you'd be whipped as well by an older slave. So if you didn't have an overseer or master do it, you could have another slave do it for them. Okay. So you were also required to learn English, not only to understand and communicate with your master and the overseers, but also to each other because the Africans came from different regions, right? It's like the old biblical story about the Tower of Babel. Right, all of these Africans came from different regions. There's like thousands of dialects from Africa, hundreds just in West Africa. So them learning English was, I guess, beneficial for everyone, although it slowly erased their language over time, which is terrible. Right? They were conditioned to withstand their potential buyers examining and touching them all over, usually plied with small meals and rum days before the actual auction. So when you got to that, there was no part of your body that wasn't examined. Now, specifically, male slaves were examined not only for their physique, so they're looking for muscles, they're looking for strength, right? Because they want you to do the heavy work. But also they would examine your genitals because they believe that a male slave who has larger genitals could have more strong slave children. So it's profitable for the next generation, right? In contrast, slave women were examined for their curves, not only their strength, but their curves, right? Because they believe a woman with bigger hips can have more children. So they look for that as well. Nobody wanted a slave who would fight back during the auction. For male slaves, as I mentioned, their reproductive parts were especially examined. Okay. Some slaves who intended to sell to southern plantations would first work their slaves in a sugar plantation for a couple of weeks in order to break them into hard labor conditions. Remember, I mentioned that they were often threatened with being sent to the West Indies because the sugar plantations were much more dangerous, right? Well, sometimes they would be trained there, and they'd be like, "Ugh, this is terrible." Now, once African slaves arrived at their final destinations and were subsequently sold to their new masters, they undergo the immediate adjustment to their new lives. Dubbed seasoning, right, the overall term of this topic, it describes the first 2 years of a slave's life, with 20,000 annually not being able to survive. Okay, so the conditions were so terrible that 20,000 people a year would die just trying to get used to becoming slaves. Right? They don't generally talk about this. If you look at video C, there's a documentary sort of along the lines with Roots, although it's not based on that book I just mentioned, talking about the slave markets in general and how serious they were. So not only was the hard labor an adjustment, right, but also the punishments that they received for disobeying, the change of climate, right, they're used to hot weather and now in some cases they'd be in cold weather if you worked in the north, and strikingly different culture of their masters. Some also committed suicide during this process. Many decided that appearing to conform to the seasoning was in their best interest, so they believed that, just playing along would keep you alive, right? Which in some cases it does, honestly. Older slaves would sometimes be in charge of the seasoning process, teaching newly purchased slaves how to work in labor gangs, good behavior, and how to translate the skills that they brought from Africa to their new lives. So that was part of the old slaves' job too, right? If they're not able to work as much, at least they could train the younger slaves. It's like when it's not quite the same, but sort of along the lines of when you start to work, an older employee will train you. Their typical days were very difficult, making the adjustment process long and exhausting. Additionally, slaves worked more than 16-hour days, expected to work long, hard days on little sleep, and they were given minimal amount of provisions as well. So here you can see a buyer at the slave market sort of examining this potential slave. So here is a slave woman on auction. Sometimes they'd have a formal auctioning block. Sometimes they do it at a saloon in the back, right? Sometimes they just have like a pole or a stone in the ground. They'd have the slave stand on top of that and just do it right off the ship. But did you know that the largest slave market in America was actually Central Park, New York? Right, that's where they did the most of the selling of the slaves. So here is an account of what a typical slave could expect, okay? Again, it depended regionally, but this is an overall count. So this says, they were summoned at 5 in the morning to begin their work. This work may be divided into two kinds, the culture of the fields and the collection of grass for cattle. The last is the most laborious and intolerable employment, as the grass can only be collected blade by blade, and is to be fetched frequently twice a day at a considerable distance from the plantation. In these two occupations they are jointly taken up, with no other intermission than that of taking their subsistence twice till 9 at night. Subsistence meaning food. They then separate for their respective huts when they gather sticks, prepare their supper, and attend their families. This employs them till midnight when they go to rest. Such is their daily way of life for rather more than half the year. There's 16 hours, including 2 intervals at meals, in the service of their masters. They're employed 3 afterwards in their own necessary concerns, 5 only for sleep, and their day is finished. So that's what you can expect your schedule to look like if you were a slave. And here they are working in the field. I believe this is a cotton field. We'll talk about cotton later on because it doesn't really become a hugely profitable crop until the early 1800s. And here's a passage about slave punishments. He said, "This instrument erases the skin and cuts out small portions of the flesh at almost every stroke, and is so frequently applied that the smack of it all day long in the ears of those who are in the vicinity of the plantations." They're talking about whips as well. The severity of masters or managers to their slaves, which is considered only as common discipline, is attended with bad effects. It enables them to behold instances of cruelty without commiseration, and to be guilty of them without remorse. Hence, those many acts of deliberate mutilation that have taken place on the slightest occasions, hence those many acts of inferior, though shocking barbarity, that have taken place without any occasion at all. The very slitting of ears has been considered as an operation so perfectly devoid of pain as to have been performed for no other reason than that for which a brand is set upon cattle as a mark of property. So essentially this is talking about different means of torture or punishment, and the masters could get away with this. So let's talk next about the dynamics between master and slave, right? Because you can't carry on a couple 100-year operation without having some sort of boundaries between the two. Okay. So here is a slave with your master or overseer. The definition of the relationship between master and slave is crucial in order for the institution to succeed. Masters had to maintain an air of absolute authority or risk slave rebellions, low production, and runaways. Consequently, these outcomes also could come to pass if masters were too lenient with their slaves. Colonial masters gambled greatly when they decided to form plantations, as they were generally looking for a quick profit. In order to achieve this, they relied on their slaves to turn a quick profit through their work in the fields, while operating on a criminally low cost of living. Although masters were aided through laws that curbed black rights, their default method of control was, of course, rooted in violence. Beatings, mutilation, rape, murder, and selling low-use slaves were legal during this time and acted as reminders to those who contemplated escape. Okay, so essentially, right? So think about you and your parents, right? If your parents don't establish rules for you, you could potentially step all over them, right? Or think of me as your educator, right? Your professor. If I didn't have certain guidelines for class, you could just do whatever you wanted, right? If I didn't have any points for the assignments, any tests to check how you're doing, it would be chaos, right? So that's sort of the power dynamics that kind of work in our society, right? If you have someone who is supposed to be superior over somebody else, they have to have certain authority, right? The way the masters did this, of course, was through intimidation and fear and torture, right? Using these things to demonstrate to other slaves, like, hey, if you go against me, this will happen to you. So it's not right at all, obviously. But this is how slavery was maintained and why we didn't have as many runaways as we could have had, right? Because a lot of people wonder, well, why didn't the slaves just try to escape? Like, there's more of them in certain areas than the master. But you got to remember, as we move through this class, you'll see that the entire society made laws and rules against not only slaves, but black people in general. So even if you got freedom, you didn't necessarily have opportunity. So that's why we call slavery systematic, right? Meaning that it's within the system and it's very hard to operate against the system. So if you take a look at video D, this is an explanation of an October 1669 law that allowed the use of torture. Okay, and sort of describing the law and what it allowed and things like that. Okay, so the last two topics for today, we're going to start our third lecture, Part 3, African Americans in Colonial America. So we're going to talk largely about what the slave experience was like in different regions of the U.S., different states, and sort of like what slavery was like leading up to the Revolutionary War, right? Which we will get to in the next PowerPoint. Okay. So first we start with the Chesapeake. It was one of the biggest slaveholding regions in the U.S. and had some of the wealthiest planters. The Chesapeake is a overall term for the states of Maryland and Virginia. Okay, and largely they grew a lot of tobacco, which you can see in this picture is a tobacco plantation. Okay. So if you take a look at video E, there's info on the first slaves that arrived to America, which of course they arrived to Jamestown, Virginia, which we talked about last time, so you can check that out. Until the late 17th century, white indentured servants were the ones who worked the Chesapeake tobacco farms, which were situated along the Chesapeake Bay that hugs both Maryland and Virginia. Okay. Remember we talked about indentured servants and how they come over from Europe mostly because they're poor and they want a new life in America, right? So they work for free for a few years. Before the 1660s, Chesapeake planters purchased very few African slaves, although they saw how profitable the sugar plantations in the Caribbean were becoming because of their labor. Thus, the status of Africans in Maryland, Virginia was at first unclear, as some were slaves, servants, or free. Okay, so this sort of mixed bag was very confusing for people. There were, however, Africans who were brought over as indentured servants, free to have other African servants and sometimes whites as their indentured servants. These were the earliest ones, right, before we started getting that, that law that said that you took on the status of your mother. At the time, white indentured servants were a lot cheaper because Caribbean slave traders were able to drive up the prices, and because of the seasoning process, slaves' lives were an expensive gamble, right? Remember we talked about how 20,000 died every year? If you paid a lot for that slave, you're losing that money. However, when the English economic depression that was going on at the time began to calm down, the indentured servants available also decreased, causing Chesapeake planters to seek African slaves as more of an investment. So that's the issue with indentured servants, right? If they're able to get jobs in Europe, they're not going to come over here, right? So that is why they turned more to slaves, because they couldn't get as many poor white indentured servants. By 1675, Maryland and Virginia increased their purchase of slaves substantially, and by 1690, African slaves outnumbered white indentured servants in this region. Don't think that this was too bad for the indentured servants, because by this time, Virginia was giving them 50 acres of land each once they completed their contracts, so often these indentured servants would become slave owners themselves. On the tobacco farms, slaves were responsible for harvesting, drying, and packaging the tobacco for shipment. So here's a bigger picture of that process. And sometimes you will see pictures of the African slaves working side by side with white indentured servants. Now, this one doesn't depict that. And keep in mind that tobacco wasn't like the cigarettes we have now. We didn't have the chemical nicotine in them, which made them addictive. People just like to smoke them. So our last topic today is the Carolinas. This is before North and South Carolina split up, okay, eventually. But South Carolina was a huge place for slave trading as well. It was one of the first or biggest places for it, like Charleston or Charlestown, South Carolina, which we'll talk about, was one of the biggest cities for slave trading. As I can see in this picture, there are mothers and their children being sold in this region. Now, if you take a look at the final video, video F, this video shows the history of Charleston and its slave market and kind of shows you what the slave market looks like a little bit today. If you go to the East Coast, you can definitely see where they sold slaves. In the Carolinas, slaves were at first hard to obtain because they were so popular in the West Indies, making them expensive, as we mentioned, right? This changed in the Carolinas with the establishment of the colonies of Charlestown, now Charleston, and the province of Carolina in 1670. Charlestown was one of the first extensively planned cities in English-speaking America. It was also never formally brought under the British government. Okay, so what that means is people actually sat down, they drew blueprints for the city and planned it out, right? Before you just have a settlement and the city would grow from that, right? Now you have formally planned cities. Also, the second thing, right? Not brought under the British government, meaning they weren't under British rule, which meant they could do their own thing. So that gave them a lot of freedom. Its first settlers were planters from Bermuda and Barbados, who popularized the use of African slave labor in the region. So they brought their own slaves over to Charlestown, and that's how slavery became big there. By 1708, of the 400,000 African slaves who were brought to the colonies, 40% originally landed at Sullivan's Island off the coast of Charlestown, where they sat in lazaretos, which were quarantine stations, for a minimum of 10 days before traveling to the slave markets. So they even had quarantine back then, right? Although for terrible purposes. This quarantine was to make sure that they didn't have any diseases they brought over from Africa, that they were well enough to work, that they could be sold, things like that. Free blacks also came to Charlestown, where wealthy whites sometimes took them as consorts, meaning as sexual paramours, right? Or basically they had them for sex. Rice and indigo plantations were mainly erected in this region as it could not support the profitable tobacco trade. Indigo is the plant that makes blue dye. However, these trades soon became very profitable as planters looked specifically for African slaves who came from the regions that specialized in those particular plants, which is smart, right? Because if you're growing them, you want people that have been growing them for generations. Mainly, slaves in this area were sold on the ships that they arrived on or in local taverns. With the initial runaways and minor rebellions, the 1739 Security Act was passed, which required all white men to carry weapons on them at all times, in fear of rebellions. Additionally, as a means of controlling their slaves, the 1740 Negro Act required one white person for every 10 black slaves. So you couldn't have a bunch of slaves on your plantation without at least one white person per 10 slaves to look after them. So here are a couple of female slaves working in the fields. We'll talk about how many actually worked in the fields versus the house later on. Okay, here's some of that information that I just said. This is a depiction of rice fields, of course, because rice fields need to be flooded partially in order for the rice to grow. The act also banned black slaves from gathering, growing their own food, earning money, or learning to read. Drums were also banned as they were used by African slaves to traditionally signal to others. So they banned most of these things so you not only would not have too much independence, but you also wouldn't be able to secretly plan to run away together. Congolese, meaning from the Congo, and Angolan, meaning from Angola, slaves were mostly avoided, as they were believed to be the biggest provocateurs of slave rebellion. So they believed these two regions specifically had people who liked to rebel. By the mid-18th century, Charlestown became the hub of the southern slave trade. Because of this and the success of their plantations, Charlestown also became the wealthiest city in British North America for a while. Okay, so the wealthiest people traded out of Charlestown. Even though some of the wealthiest people lived mainly in Virginia, Charlestown itself was one of the wealthiest cities. And here's another picture of a slave market. See how chaotic it is. So that is the end of today's lecture. We are going to continue next time with this PowerPoint by talking about other states, including New England, New York, and New Jersey, New France, and Florida. Okay, so those will be our topics next time. We're going to see what these states or regions did with regard to slavery or slave rebellions or what have you. Okay, there's a lot of stuff to cover for the third PowerPoint, so we're going to have quite a few lectures with regards to this.